with the emerging, microplastic issue, let's say, biodiversity loss, how can or where do LCAs fail to capture other metrics?
First, I'll just say I'm glad you didn't say there's 16 impacts. Now name every single one of them.
We don't have time for that. Yeah.
I'll always miss
Quick
it.
Google. Welcome back to Demystifying Cosmetics, the podcast where we peel back the label claims, ingredient lists, and industry jargon to uncover what's really going on in beauty and personal care. Today's conversation takes us into the world of life cycle assessments, the tools often used to evaluate the environmental impact of a product from formulation to disposal. You've likely seen the claims 95% less carbon, or low impact formula, or eco-friendly packaging. But what do these metrics really measure, and what might they leave out? To help us decode the nuances of cosmetic LCAs, I'm joined by Evan Peters, the founder of Fairglow, a sustainability consultancy that helps beauty brands navigate environmental data with more transparency and less greenwashing. From defining system boundaries and choosing between cradle-to-gate versus cradle-to-grave models to the ethics of marketing interpretation and the limits of what LCAs can capture, we'll explore how this tool is used and misused across the beauty industry. We'll also look at the bigger picture, what LCAs miss, the role of third-party verification, and why social and biodiversity impacts might deserve just as much attention as carbon footprint. Let's get into it. Welcome, Evan. How are you doing today?
I'm doing good. Thank you very much. It's cool to have some LCA jargon dropped right there in the intro, the boundary conditions, everything.
I know. Well, we have a short time. I've got to really inundate the listeners.
Pack it in.
Exactly. Yeah. So, I'd love to learn a little bit about Fairglow and kind of how you really got into this industry, because, it's not obvious, in meeting you that you were some aspiring child that was like, what I want to do when I grow up? Yeah. I want to get deep into the supply chain of cosmetics. So.
Yeah, that would have been troubling if I had said that as a child. Yeah, so how did we get here? I've been working in environmental tech for about a decade. I started at a company in Texas doing waste stream sorting. So I was developing algorithms to identify if something was hazardous or not, basically whether you could throw it away, recycle it, or you had to have some guy in a hazmat suit come pick it up. After that, I went to do business school here in France at INSEAD, and I worked for a startup doing carbon accounting. And that's where I learned that carbon accounting, carbon measurements are kind of done in a very poor manner these days. They use things called financial emission factors that we can maybe get into later. But long story short, it's very inaccurate. So I left that thinking, well, to actually make an impact, we're going to need to change the way we measure things. And so I combined this newfound experience in carbon measurement and my old experience analyzing deeply these personal care products. And we created Fairglow about 3 years ago now.
In the intro and a little bit on what you're talking about in terms of the inaccuracy of carbon capture and the conclusions that are then inevitably drawn from them, let's talk a little bit about system boundaries, kind of this foundational concept to the life cycle analysis, or LCA, and how those boundaries shape the conclusions that can be drawn from this type of assessment.
Yeah, of course. So depending on the level of some of your listeners, in life cycle analysis, your boundaries is a really key feature. And what does boundaries means? It basically means to what level are you zooming in on your study? Because in life cycle analysis, if you don't have a well-defined boundary, your analysis can go on forever. Yeah. And I can give a small pet example of, say, you use rose oil in a formulation. Right. So those roses have to be grown somewhere and they have to be fertilized. And usually that's going to be part of your boundaries. Like, how were these roses cultivated and then processed and then shipped to me? And that'll be part of your boundary of the LCA. But theoretically, you can continue further and say, well, how is that fertilizer made? And what were the conditions to make that factory for that fertilizer? And what did the guy have for lunch when he was operating the forklift to come here? So it can kind of go on forever. So defining your boundaries is a key part of LCA, and how it works for us is we focus on the finished product, right? A finished blush, a finished shampoo, a finished facial moisturizer. But to do so, we have to go back all the way in the supply chain to the ingredient itself. And so we'll draw a line at the ingredient manufacturing and raw material sourcing, and we will do the upstream transport of those materials to whatever factory or formulation space. And then we will also try to track the end of life of these products, including, how is the packaging being disposed of, the environmental fate when these things go down the drain, what happens there, the toxicity to aquatic environments. And so these are all captured in Fairglow, which is we've developed a software tool for users to basically be able to inspect all of these parameters, what's in my product, and how is it affecting the environment.
And do you take into account things such as the consumer use phase? So if I'm using a shampoo, right, I'm going to have more water use than if I'm using a blush in this example.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is a tough part of life cycle analysis on these downstream effects, because obviously, I can't know if you use a super hot shower or a decently hot shower, but we do our best. We have tons of data on basically water heating habits in France versus Germany versus the US, on the average length of showers, on the average uses of shampoos, and we put that in for people to track. But see, that's fun, and if people go to the Fairglow blog, they can see all these Monte Carlo analyses we've done on different use phases and, moving these parameters around, seeing the impacts. But what's most important for formulators is when they get their hands on Fairglow, they can basically say, oh, this packaging configuration versus that one. And what are my effects on carbon? It's hard to control your use phase aside from just not selling shampoo. And I don't want to encourage people to not sell shampoo. I think that's a fine product.
Well, I feel like the information that you have collected in terms of consumer behavior in and of itself is a very interesting data set that you could sell should Fairglow not work out, but also make really good stereotypes on. So if ever we want to have that be something to discuss on a podcast, is the habits of European countries, definitely. And, when you talk about the formulators being able to choose and the use of Fairglow, so talk to me a little bit about, kind of how each of maybe a formulator versus, marketing versus somebody who's more in line with like brand development is using the Fairglow software tool.
Yeah, sure. So there's different personas, I suppose. So we work a lot with ESG or sustainability professionals, right? So some cosmetic brand has been tasked with, we want to know our carbon outlay. And the best way to do that is to know your products and say, okay, this product line attribute this much, this product line attribute that much, because that's where you're buying all your materials, your packaging, your shipping. Your business is selling cosmetics, that's where your carbon's going to come from. It's versus if you use other software tools, they'll just ask you how much money you spent and say that amount of money equals this amount of carbon. So an ESG professional will work with us and basically learn the LCA of their entire product portfolio. We'll look at their sales data there and then say, according to this, you have this much carbon here, this much water here, this much, any of the 16 impacts that are covered by the product environmental footprint. And so that's very useful. We do scenario analyses for them to say, okay, what's your goal? You want to reduce by 15% in 5 years. Here's these different pathways to do so. We have other people using our tool almost for like a quality assurance. We're realizing we have so much data and it's organized in such a nice way for these products that some people are starting to use our tool just as a screening, because they want to make sure they don't have any glycol esters in their formula for whatever reason. And our tool is able to easily screen their products.
Interesting. I think we talked a little bit about it, and even you mentioning the end of life, but you don't always have to measure end of life in an LCA, correct? There's this concept of the cradle-to-gate approach versus cradle-to-grave. So if it's not obvious, tell us a little bit about what the difference between those two are.
Yeah.
And basically the trade-off, or even kind of the loophole in that, right? If I have a package that I know is just not going to be good, I might say I want to do a cradle to gate approach.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, so that was the good jargon we started with. So cradle to gate is basically saying, what are all of the emissions from this raw material until it got to my factory? And then sometimes I'll add another one, which is just gate to gate, which is just looking at what are the processes under my roof, under my factory? Like what happened? Let's just ignore all the emissions up until my materials got here. What can I control right here? And then you can take it further, which is cradle to grave. So that is a true, I don't know if people are going to bully me online for calling it a true LCA, but
all five of my listeners,
that's the real life cycle analysis. It's tracking everything that went into this product or service from its inception, the cradle, all the way to when it's returned back to the environment. Everything's returned back to the environment in some way or another, whether it's in a landfill or it gets reused in some way. So the trade-offs are huge, right? Because you can choose to zoom in on whatever makes you look good or sustainable, or vice versa. That's why it's less important from a sustainability perspective to try to shame a shampoo or a blush which has higher end of life and utilization emissions. What's more important is just knowing that it exists, right? So for all the users out there, when you're buying a product, when you think about the emissions, it's really not going to be whether that the plastic had more PCR, post-consumer recycled content. If it's a shampoo, the best thing you could always do is take a shorter, colder shower. Like that's just a fact. If it's a blush, the best thing you could do is try to reduce your makeup removal phase. If it's, use less cotton pads, or when you wash your face, try to use as little hot water as possible.
Yeah. So I guess what I'm hearing you say in terms of how the consumer can start to think about, being, I guess, more participatory. What's the word? Participating in? I don't know.
Sounds good.
Yeah, right. In, helping to be more cognizant of the environment, it seems like you're saying it's less about what that published LCA might say about the product because of these nuances in terms of, misusing the results to indicate product sustainability.
Well, so first I would say big kudos to any cosmetic manufacturer publishing an LCA. The numbers are startlingly low. And the reason is because LCA until Fairglow has been extremely cost prohibitive and time consuming. And at the end, you didn't really know what you could do. So that's one of the reasons Fairglow is here, is to kind of attack all these problems with LCA, which takes too long. Fairglow, we can do your whole portfolio in a matter of weeks. It's cost prohibitive. At Fairglow, we want it to be affordable to small brands so they can actually get involved in sustainability. And then lastly, typically you'd get a big PDF report and you'd say with a bunch of numbers that you have no idea what they mean.
You don't know how to make a change. Yeah.
Yeah. And then what's my scale for knowing the, eutrophication potential of my product? That's not a word most people have ever heard before. So what Fairglow does to mitigate that issue is we give you these levers to pull. We say, hey, you know what? What's your goal? And here are these different pathways to do it. Next time you're sourcing packaging, let's compare these two bottles. This bottle A says it has 30% more PCR. Let's just plug it into Fairglow and see what that will mean for your bottom line for carbon.
Yeah, because right, like, oh, your PCR is coming from Malaysia, right? Like,
Yeah,
and you're
we can.
producing in the U.S. Like,
Yeah,
it isn't always
you
straightforward.
you don't need to guess with Fairglow, right? That's the
Yeah.
thing. Is so many people with their sustainability, they kind of at the end throw up their hands and say, "All right, let's put some solar panels on the roof," right? It's like, well, it's time to quantify this. We want you to measure twice and cut once. It's hard for you to reduce your impact if you don't even know what it is to begin with.
So I'm curious to hear if, because of the transparency that is required and engagement from vendors, package suppliers, resin suppliers, if you've had some parts of the industry maybe not so happy that you are making this transparent.
Yeah. So I mean, well, big disclosure. We don't make this data transparent unless our clients want to, right? So we will never do an LCA and then put it
Yeah,
on the website and say, "Hey, take a look at
airing
CeraVe
dirty
here."
laundry. Yeah,
Yeah. So that's a big point. Is LCA has a ton of proprietary data, right? We will know the locations of your packaging suppliers and where you're getting your ingredients. Um, so but to answer your question, are some people less happy about it? Yes, that is sometimes an issue in sustainability, is people will be very excited. Oh, measure me, let me see. And then at the end, we might say to you, ooh, you're not doing so good. And they're like, oh, shucks, I thought I was paying you for good news, not just true news.
yeah, yeah.
But on the whole, brands are really excited that Fairglow is bringing this LCA tool that is really easy to use. LCA has been this very esoteric discipline for a long time, and it still is. It's a complicated field, but we want people in the cosmetics industry to be able to see data that they're familiar with and be able to edit it in a way and see live impact changes.
Okay, real quick. Raise your hand if you have dealt with active instability. If you have ever opened a jar of retinol cream and smelt an off odor, or noticed your formula went dark brown, chances are you are dealing with active instability. It's never fun when the formula you've been working on goes south and the due date is only days away. That's why we've encapsulated the trickier ingredients to work with so you can kick the stability struggle to the curb. From retinol to vitamin C, we make it easier to work with those ingredients that typically give you that 3 p.m. headache. The cellulose shell shields the active from outside exposure, things like air and light, that are likely to cause active breakdown, giving you the power to create stable and effective formulas without the trial and error. Ready to quickly create effective skincare formulas? Discover Tagra's Cellucaps line by going to tagra.com/cellucaps. So, have you encapsulated yet? Now back to the show.
You mentioned a group of kind of professionals that you work with regularly, but there is some third-party verification bodies that do play a role in ensuring, the rigor of an LCA and transparency. Can you talk to us a little bit about the role of those third-party verification bodies?
Yeah, third-party verification is huge in LCA. In fact, if you ever want to publish an LCA that's comparative, meaning saying I do 10% better than so-and-so, the ISO body has said you need a third-party verification. And there's some, I'm not actually sure because it switches every week, but the Green Claims Directive, which is a big thing in Europe, has some language in there talking about needing third-party verification just for any quantified claim, which personally I think that might stymie sustainability efforts. Just because people will be, if I do an LCA, to get a third-party verification for that LCA is going to double the cost and time.
Yeah. Just hearing that, the activation energy, I was like, ugh.
Yeah, exactly. It's gonna slow things down. But to summarize, third-party verification is extremely important because of all these challenges we just talked about. Are these boundary conditions appropriate? We want the third party to say like, hey, honestly, you're skipping a big portion where a lot of emissions might come from. Therefore, this LCA might be misleading. or just double checking that the emission factors used or the activity data involved in the LCA was appropriate. So they still play a huge role. For Fairglow, we are in the process of having every step of our methodology independently reviewed for the second time, because we want basically everyone to have taken a look and said, that looks good and clean.
Yeah, it's kind of good to have some sort of independent group that doesn't have a bias to take a look at the data and have a review and have a different perspective, for sure.
Exactly. Trust in this industry is everything. So you do a measurement and people are you could have an endless stream of questions, just as the boundaries of LCA are endless. The negotiation, so to speak, of, well, should you include that? Should you not include that? Yeah. Should you do this or that? So it's better to have a third party just say, honestly, we've looked over everything. It looks good. Now you can move on with your business.
Do these third parties also help to develop the basic principles in terms of what you to answer those questions, instead of having it be a conversation every time?
Yeah, that would be the ideal. So in Europe, you have the product environmental footprint, which is kind of like an LCA guidebook, and they expanded it with these things called category rules, meaning for like each consumer good category, they defined a basic boundary system. Say, and the LCA practitioner will include this phase and not include that phase. However, cosmetics has been woefully overlooked. So the last big study was done in 2014. And so it's been a blank space. So there's been people that have kind of defined their own methodologies, Fairglow included. So we've basically taken the principles of the PEF and created our own boundaries. But we also say, as soon as there's a government buy-in on a methodology, that's the one we can use, and we can switch. We're methodology agnostic, is what we want to say. Is if you have a specific boundary that you want to apply, we can of course make that work for you.
Although it does seem that you guys have been able to accelerate this process, kind of capture and utilize data that maybe previously wasn't leveraged. That, do you feel as if maybe Fairglow should also be starting to advocate for what those basic principles should be?
Yeah, of course, but it's hard for us to kind of boil the ocean at once. We're trying to just we want people just to start measuring their products. We want it to be a normal thing for I'm developing a new product. Let's look at the water footprint. Let's take a look at the land use footprint. And once we start, because right now there's just not a lot of data literacy on these subjects, but that could change quickly. As soon as you start seeing these footprints around, you can start to get a sense of this is a good versus bad product. And that's what we need. We need that in every industry, if this is a good versus bad product. And that way I can de-incentivize the bad and incentivize the good.
Yeah. We talk about sustainability often in the industry as really these broad, sustainability. And I think the first thing people tend to think about is the idea of, carbon emissions. But as you mentioned previously, there are 16 areas that an LCA can measure in terms of, water use, land use. With the emerging, microplastic issue, let's say, biodiversity loss, how can or where do LCAs fail to capture other metrics?
Mm-hmm. First, I'll just say I'm glad you didn't say there's 16 impacts. Now name every single one of them.
We don't have time for that.
I'll always miss
Quick
it.
Google.
No, so the question is, where does LCA kind of fail to capture some of the traditional concepts associated with sustainability? So LCA, to start, is internationally recognized as the best and most appropriate method for quantifying environmental impact. Yeah. So, they've been bandied over thousands of times, and people are like, this is the best way to do it. However, there are some things that LCA fails to capture, like you just mentioned. So biodiversity is a tough concept in general.
Yeah.
There's some algorithms that combine several elements of an LCA to give you a biodiversity score. The recipe 2016 algorithm does that. But as a pet example, if I'm making a new cosmetic ingredient and to source it, I need to go, harvest an endangered species. That LCA is not going to really cover that unless I use a helicopter to fly in there and use a lot of jet fuel.
Yeah.
The LCA, the carbon footprint of that ingredient might be pretty low. So it's not capturing that. Microplastics is another one. If it's kind of pollution on a physical scale like that, it's hard to capture. Toxicity to the human body is captured very well in LCA, but these kind of emergent sustainability related elements, LCA is not going to capture.
Yeah. Another thing that LCAs, maybe because it really is focused on this kind of environmental sustainability that they don't capture, is in line with the social and ethical impacts. So, for example, the use of Uyghur labor in China.
Sure.
Do you think those should be integrated into the LCA, or do you think that is a little bit of a separate social audit?
Yeah, so that's tough. The market thinks it should be integrated because that's actually, people start to associate the two together, right? Oh, to do a LCA, I need some supply chain information. Well, while you're doing that, you're kind of understanding, did this come from, a war-torn nation or a Uyghur region, for example. Right now, there are tools, there's social LCA, it's SLCA, that try to capture these elements. Yeah, exactly. They need to hit the naming convention a little harder. But there are tools that exist for this, and we're looking into integration. But I usually say LCA has so many variables and so many use cases. It's a very valuable tool, and you might lose some of the value by trying to throw too many objectives onto it, right?
Yeah.
Not to say like all this supply chain stuff needs to be tracked, whether palm oil is RSPO or not, or whether slash and burn farming was utilized. All of these are impactful on a social scale, but also on an LCA scale, right?
Yeah. So there are elements that it does capture.
Yeah, there'll be some emergent elements from there. I mean, as an aside, there's stuff around, people associate sustainability and organicity or naturality a lot, right? So these are labels that your viewers will be familiar with. However, these aren't necessarily correlated with true environmental impact, right?
Yeah. Yep.
The correlation is in our head. The correlation is actually a marketing thing we've been fed for a long time. We've seen very, very natural formulations that have ginormous carbon impacts or water impacts. So that's another thing you're not capturing necessarily in LCA, right? The naturality, if that's your objective, is that it was grown. And I don't care if it was grown using tons of fertilizer that led to horrible eutrophication and the carbon footprint was crazy.
Yeah.
But if that's what you're indexing on, LCA might not cover that as accurately as some other systems of measurement.
Yeah. It's interesting to think about. I know at Archaea, the use of biotech, we used to give the example of rose oil and how many petals of roses it took to create 1 milliliter of rose oil. And so, saying that is sustainable in terms of your, environmental impact, I would argue synthetic is better in that case, in a lot of cases.
Absolutely. We have the data to show it. Like a lot of, a rose oil, our simulations, depending on some of these conditions on how it was distilled and grown, you're talking 5,000 to 15,000 kilograms of CO2 per kilogram of this material. So it's about 50 times more emitting than the synthetic fragrance from a carbon perspective.
I mean, I feel like it'd be very interesting to publish. They always come out with the kind of like dirty list for vegetables and fruits on which have the highest degree of like pesticides. So like you should wash them.
Yeah.
But like that list for cosmetics and like the ingredients that really we should start to phase out.
We are actually in the process of doing that. So we've studied thousands and thousands of different species cultivations that are used in. So first off, there's 30,000 approximately inkies, which are cosmetic ingredients. Yeah. Of those, about 14,000 are plant derived.
Okay.
An equal proportion synthetic, and then the rest are kind of animal / mineral / a growing proportion are fermented. So we call those biotech ingredients. And on the plant side, we've spent a tremendous amount of effort and research on understanding how are these plants cultivated all over the world and then processed. So we're very close to having the first of its kind, a true emission factor database for all of these ingredients, so anyone can look up and say, hey, on average, what is my shea butter going to be emitting? And we even have a calculator for our current users, so they can say, oh, I got this shea butter from Burkina Faso, and then it's shipped to my factory here.
And I'm using it at X percentage of the formula.
Exactly. And so that's things that users can already do in Fairglow.
Awesome. Well, great. So, in thinking about everything we discussed today, what, in your view, are the tools that companies should be using in addition to LCAs to get a more holistic picture of product impact? I know first and foremost, LCA, best practices. What are you seeing in terms of when, brands get this data? What are they missing? How are they misinterpreting it? And what can be used to help support integration of LCA as a routine tool?
Yeah, of course. I mean, the first thing, or step 0, basically, is you need to get digitized. You need to have an ERP. You need to have some sort of system where if someone says, what's the formulation of this product and what was the packaging used and where did I ship it to? In a lot of companies today, that's like a detective work. You have to combine 10 different systems, and even then your outcome's not very certain. So get digitized. There's tons of ERPs designed for cosmetic companies. And then if you want sustainable measurements, really Fairglow is kind of the only option for you taking that data once you have it organized. And we are able to easily translate that into impact per product, impact for your company, et cetera. In terms of other tools to keep track of supply chain, I've seen some cool things around blockchain measurements, but I'm not intelligent enough to really know how they work, so I can't advocate for them right now.
All right. Well, I appreciate the honesty.
Yeah, no worries. We're all for transparency here.
Well, awesome. This was a great conversation. Thank you so much. Where can people learn more about Fairglow?
Yeah, so go to fairglow.fr. We are a French company. And if you want a demo or to see the tool in action, there's a contact page there. Otherwise, I post some nerdy stuff on LinkedIn, and you can find me, Evan Peters at Fairglow. You get little data snippets here and there.
Awesome. Well, great. Thank you again.